Today, I wanted to make a video on the difference between a sales engineer and a direct tech sales role like an SDR or account executive. There's a few different ways to break this down, both from a compensation and career trajectory standpoint. So I wanted to talk about both. Depending on your background, a lot of the folks I work with, as an example, come from programming, a STEM type of background. You may align well with a sales engineer, but it's also important to know that the longer term upside is slightly lower from a strict compensation standpoint. So let's break it down from both sides. From the direct tech sales role level, one, from a day-to-day responsibility, you're not ever going to be in a situation where you're writing code. You may be expected to know the ins and outs of the product, and it will be advantageous to do so. But if you're ever talking about a single line of code or a very minute feature within the product, you're probably not doing your job effectively. Now, as we look at more of a career trajectory standpoint, I guess the trade-off from not getting super deep into the weeds on the technical standpoint is you have to do a lot of manual things like generating proposals, updating Salesforce, and making sure you're taking extensive notes of all these opportunities. Obviously, you've got to do things like calling, emailing, all of these different presentations, etc., right? That's a little bit different than the sales engineering role, though it does have elements of presentation, things of this nature. When you look at it from a compensation standpoint, the SDR level is typically coming in anywhere from maybe $60,000 to, on the high side, $100,000 per year. That's base and variable commission. Now, as you go to account executive, the highest levels of enterprise account executive, strategic account executive, compensation can reach around $300,000 or $400,000 a year. And that's usually, to oversimplify, on a 50-50 split. So if my salary is $300,000 a year, 50% of that is base salary. So I get $150,000 just like a normal 9-to-5 employee. And then the other $150,000 is based on my performance and attainment towards quota. So if I had to sell $1 million of products to make up the other portion, and I sell $1 million, over the course of that year, I'll get checks that sum to the extra $150,000 of that salary. Now, as we look at the sales engineer side, strictly from a salary standpoint, it changes a little bit differently. And depending on the company, I've seen a few different models. Sometimes that split is anywhere from 70-30 in terms of base salary to commission, but also the overall number is typically on the enterprise side a little bit lower. So as a sales engineer, if you're coming in and earlier in your career, your total compensation, whereas an SDR is entering around 60 to 100,000, if you maybe have a year or two of engineering experience, switch to a sales engineering role, you might come in maybe 1 to 140, maybe even a little bit higher depending on where you're at, right? So out of the gate, you do make a lot more money up front. On the long-term side, when you get into these really enterprise and strategic motions, the compensation is still great. But whereas an enterprise account executive might be $300,000, maybe in some cases $350 to $400, a sales engineer at the highest level of an individual role, again, not management, any of that, is typically coming in around maybe $200,000 to $250,000, maybe in some extreme cases $275,000. And again, that is skewed. 70% of that is base salary, so you do have more of that portion that's kind of guaranteed. And then there's a smaller component that is commission based. Now, if you think about this, as an account executive, there's more upside because if 50% of my salary is based on my commission, there's also no cap. So I am basically making the same money or more after I hit 100% of my number. And in some companies, in many cases, there's accelerators to where if I'm exceeding quota, I make not only the standard commission rate, but even more on top of that, like twice the commission, right? So as a sales engineer, if only 30% of your salary is commission based, when you hit 100% of your number and continue exceeding, that gap over time starts to widen. So there is more upside as a direct account executive role. Obviously on the surface, a $300,000 salary versus a $250,000 salary sounds like a big gap. But when you do have a difference in guarantee, whether it's 70% or 80% of your base salary as a sales engineer, when you only have 50% of that as an enterprise account executive, it does feel a little bit different. And keep in mind, everyone fantasizes, and it's true, I mean, it happens often, but there are enterprise account executives that will have great years, make $500,000, make $1 million in a year. And I think everyone does get caught up in that and forgets that oftentimes 30 to 50% of enterprise account executives are not hitting their number. So it is important to hear, if you have, a $300,000 salary, but you hit 50% of your number, you're only making $200,000 to $225,000 that year, which is still great, don't get me wrong, but your job is now also more volatile. Taking a step back now too, I think that hits on a broader point. When we look at job security in both industries, largely speaking, while it is, especially at the highest levels of technical sales, it's definitely a smaller pool of qualified talent, it is a more replaceable job than a sales engineer. Finding an engineer that can go very deep technically and also has the personal skills to drive a conversation and be a consultant is a very difficult skill set to find. And even now, I have good friends of mine that are sales engineers, and even though the macro economy is really bad, they're still getting offers left and right for interviews, looking at prominent tech companies to go in, because it's a very unique skill set. And I think if you like having a higher salary than maybe an individual engineer, you're going to find that in a sales engineer. And I think your job as a whole is going to be much safer and much more protected because it's such a unique skill set and hard skill set to find, and even more importantly, from a company's perspective, replace. When you leave, it's that much more difficult to find a qualified engineer who knows that technology really well, right? Or has the ability to ramp quickly. On the account executive side, again, the upside's there's always going to be jobs for salespeople, don't get me wrong. But at the same time, in times of a downturn, if you haven't hit your number, maybe you had a great year 2 years ago, now it doesn't matter as much, right? Like if you're not bringing in business consistently and it's been 2 years since you hit your number, you're pretty disposable and you might find yourself out of a job. And that's part of it. It's kind of the trade-offs of having that really high upside. I mean, sales in theory is the highest paid position outside of like CEO. From an individual contributor standpoint, you can really make a ton of money. But at the same time, it's very replaceable. Unfortunately, we're seeing now, even in the economy, a lot of account executives really getting laid off and being impacted by it, whereas I haven't seen many, if any, sales engineers that were really let go during all of these different layoffs. On the sales engineering side, you usually do have to have minimally a STEM degree and ideally some industry experience. So the one caveat to all of this that I'd say is if you're coming in as an SDR and you want to go to sales engineer long term, you better be taking a boot camp. You better be making it very known to management right out of the gate that that is your goal. And you need to see and expect that you're going to have to do a lot outside of your day job. You're not just going to go from SDR to sales engineer with no engineering experience, with no coding boot camps, with nothing, right? Again, if you have that hardcore engineering background and you're maybe not completely sold on going to a pure sales role, I think sales engineering is a great fit for all the reasons that I mentioned. You're going to make more money on most cases than just an individual engineer that's kind of working, in a room just coding 8 hours a day. You're going to get more human-facing interaction, so maybe half your day is devoted to meetings, working with your teams, et cetera, and then the other half you're actually scoping out maybe customers' requirements for a proof of concept and test of your product, and or you're maybe helping a new customer or helping someone that's testing implement that further. You won't be stuck necessarily coding 8 to 10 hours a day. You won't be having to take messages and commands from everyone up top who's saying, we need this feature or fix this or whatever it is. It is a little bit more flexible in that regard, but the dynamic changes a little bit too. It's not like you're home scot-free. Sometimes you have horribly demanding customers. Sometimes you go to do something that should be really easy, and for whatever reason, your software isn't installing correctly, right? So there are road bumps and trade-offs in either direction, but if you have that strong foundation, you're not totally sold on going to a pure sales role, I would really encourage you to look into sales engineering and see what it might take to break in. Can you find sales engineers on LinkedIn? Again, it's not my particular expertise. I do know many, but are there some that are working in industry? Have you seen former engineers make that transition? These are the people you should connect with and see what it takes to get in that role. And on the flip side, like in my case, I'm a degreed engineer. I hated engineering by the time I was done with it. Like, I enjoy being in the tech space. I enjoy the types of people, the types of projects you get to work on, but I hated being at the low level implementation of just writing code or just doing all these manual tasks when there was much more financial upside and there was a much more competitive element to sales. So for me, making that change, I was all in on sales. I still leverage my technical background. It's not like I've gone away from it completely, but I haven't written code in like 5 years and it's been great. Like, I very much enjoy the hardcore competitiveness. I do know, again, my job is a little bit riskier. It's less safe during times like this. But at the same time, having an engineering background, having a proven track record as an account executive myself now, I found it easier and a little more comforting than not having any of that past relevant background, right? So there's no right answer here. But again, I think both paths are great. Long term, there's still a lot of financial upside with the sales engineering role. You just might not tap into that completely uncapped and really high accelerated commission like an enterprise account executive has, but it's always greener on the other side, right? In reality, while we always dream about that enterprise account executive making $1 million a year, that happens, but it's not often. And 30 to 50% of account executives aren't even hitting their number. In times like this, I guarantee you it's even more, right? So it's all a balance, really depends on what you want. Yes, you'll maybe make more in a sales role, and for me, it's a great fit. I can't imagine ever being a sales engineer, ever going back to engineering. But for you, you could explore both paths. You can test both, right? Maybe you've been an engineer, try it out as an SDR. If you don't like it after a year, now you're in prime position to go and interview for a sales engineering role because you have both experiences, right? No right answer, but I hope that helps you navigate the question, and we will see you next week. Thanks.